It was the summer before my sophomore year of high school. My older brother had just gone off to college, leaving a box of 80s-era VHS tapes in the closet of his recently vacated bedroom, which was actually a renovated loft over the 2-car garage attached to my parents' house. What my brother Josh had referred to as his Mike Seaver bedroom, though I never got the reference. Well, I do now because I googled it as I was writing this, but I digress. I'd always envied the apartment-like privacy of my brother's room, and was pestering my folks to let me have it in the moment Josh announced that he was going to an out-of-state school. My mom eventually relented on the grounds that I first moved everything he left behind into my old bedroom. I quickly agreed, and the closet had been the last thing I cleaned out. When I came across the tapes, I immediately assumed vintage porn, but was quite surprised to find that the entire box was nothing but old obscure horror films. Mostly stuff with ridiculous titles and dated cover art, but being a fan of terrible B-grade horror, it was actually quite the find. The only problem was that my brother didn't have a VCR, at least not one that he left behind, and neither did my parents. I begged my mom to let me use her credit card to buy one I found online for like $30, and she of course asked me what a boy with a Blu-ray player and a laptop needed with a VCR. I explained the box of tapes in Josh's room, and she scoffed, saying, "I'm really starting to worry. You're always watching horror movies and playing those violent video games. You need to start reading more books." Well, then can I use her credit card to order books? Yeah, nice try. I spent that entire afternoon scouring all of the nearby stores, and was eventually able to locate an old DVD VCR combo player, tucked away in a dimly lit section of Best Buy's home entertainment department. And then I dusted off a price tag that read $199.99, and promptly put it back. I mean, after all, what am I, a drug dealer? I was walking home and contemplating simply swiping my mom's credit card when I spotted a large black rectangle laying beside several bags of trash that had been placed out on the sidewalk in front of a vacant lot. Odds were it was just a busted DVD player, but I stopped to check anyway, just to be sure. Imagine the look on my face when I saw that it wasn't a DVD player, but, I shit you not, an actual for realsies VCR. Hell, I practically ran home, the old bulky machine clutching to my chest and me looking like the world's most needless burglar. One of the main benefits of my new room was that I was able to enter through the garage and would thereby avoid any possible questions from my parents, who were both upper middle class white people and generally judgmental of anything that involved pilfering trash. I hurried up the stairs to my room and plugged in the machine. It was then that I discovered that, big surprise, the VCR, which I found on the side of the road, didn't work. I don't know what I was expecting, but this still managed to frustrate the shit out of me. Luckily, I was the type of guy that, when you asked who his favorite X-Man was, he answered Forge, which obviously meant two things. One, he probably enjoyed tinkering with machines, and two, even in an age where nerds were actually cool, this guy still wasn't getting laid. And so, of course, my first reaction was to retrieve a soldering iron from my dad's workbench and bust that bad boy open. Now, I sat up most of the night, Googling VCR repair manuals and watching tutorials on YouTube. Eventually, I located what seemed to be the problem, and in the end, it was a relatively easy fix. The only real speed bump was when I cut my hand while replacing the VCR's metal casing, and a few drops of blood managed to end up on one of the exposed video heads. If this had been a horror movie, I probably would have heard an ominous clap of thunder right about then, but no such luck. I carefully wiped off the Videohead, securing the casing, and I plugged in the VCR. And yet, after all of this, I was still genuinely surprised when it actually turned on. The green digital clock-style display lighting up as the machine whirred to life. I quickly hooked up the VCR and dug a tape from the bottom at random. I slid the movie, Blood Train, in, and I hit play. An image appeared on the screen, a static black and white shot of a dimly lit windowless room. The back wall looked like it was made from packed clay. Aside from the clay wall and a few feet of cement floor, the only thing visible within the frame was a rusty floor-mounted chair. Kind of like the ones you see at a dentist's office. Anyway, it was partially visible to the left side of the screen. Not exactly Kubrick-level composition, but there was something that began to feel oddly menacing about the shot as I watched it continue, uninterrupted, for almost 2 minutes. The hell is this? There was no score or audible sound of any kind, and if it hadn't been for the grainy quality of the film or the time code ticking away on the VCR's display, well, I would have thought I was looking at a still image. I tried to fast forward, but nothing happened. Hoping that this was just a busted tape, I hit eject and grabbed another movie, She-Snake, from the box. I replaced Blood Train with the new tape, and I hit play. I sat there. I blinked at my TV. The image that appeared on the screen was the same as before. The same continuous shot of the same clay wall and partially visible chair. I double-checked to make sure that I had put in a new tape, then hit the fast-forward button, and again nothing happened. Same story with the rewind and pause. I ejected the movie and was only mildly baffled when I got the same result from a third tape. For close to a minute, I just glared at the TV screen as my disbelief combined with exhaustion, and I started to turn to rage. I was reaching to hit eject and contemplating chucking the VCR out of a window when a shadow flickered across the clay wall on the screen. I glanced up at the TV just in time to see a balding old man in a pair of grimy overalls stalk into the frame. The old man was almost abnormally tall and walked with the kind of slouch one develops after a lifetime of dealing with inadequately sized spaces. In one hand, he gripped the handle of what looked to be a metal bucket, with several wires hanging from the bottom. Thin streaks of gore poured from the 2 hollow sockets where his eyes should have been, and stained the length of the man's pockmarked cheeks with streams of dried blood. Though being sans eyeballs didn't really seem to hamper the old man's vision as he stomped past the clay wall and then out of frame, leaving me sitting there on the floor in front of my television, mouth agape. And that's how I stayed for about a half an hour, just watching what basically amounted to a particularly boring security camera feed as it continued uninterrupted. In that time, the shot never cut. Nothing else appeared on screen. But it was absolutely mesmerizing. You see, so many questions ran through my head just then. Where was this room? Why was that chair there? Who was the old man? What in the ever-loving fuck was this? Even then, I wouldn't believe that there was some benign explanation for it all. Maybe Josh had been working on a student film and used these old horror movie tapes to store his footage on, and what I was actually watching was simply unedited B-roll. Maybe someone accidentally left the camera rolling between takes, but 3 times while filming the same shot. And then the old man returned, dragging a frantically kicking woman into frame. What I originally mistook for a bucket was actually a helmet-like apparatus that was currently clamped down over the woman's head. The wires hanging from the helmet were clipped to various parts of the woman's body. She continued to flail in vain as the old man used the attached handle to drag her across the room. They reached the floor-mounted chair at the edge of the frame, and a disquieting grin spread across the man's face as he squeezed the handle. The woman immediately began to vomit blood through an oval-shaped hole in the helmet, and just like that, her body went limp. The man lifted her effortlessly, placing the woman into the chair as he moved just out of frame. He then turned the chair so that the only thing still visible in the shot was a profile view of its back and part of the woman's helmet-covered head. But something told me that that was more than enough. I had the sudden overwhelming feeling that what was about to happen off-screen was something not meant to be seen. This was not footage from some movie my brother made. This wasn't footage at all. It was a window. A thought came to me from out of nowhere, clear as someone talking in my ear. Videohead. His name is Videohead. I passed out somewhere around dawn and groaned at my mom when she tried to wake me up 2 hours later. She yanked the covers out of my hands, saying, "Oh no, you saved that song and dance for a test or something. You're not faking sick your first day." Apparently, I had completely forgotten that school was starting this week. "You sure that's today?" "Yes. Me, the bus driver outside, and the 30 kids on board are all pretty sure that's today." I went through my morning classes in a half-conscious fog and then power-chugged 2 cans of Mountain Dew at lunch to ready myself for the big reveal of last night's discovery to my one and only non-internet friend, Walter. I told him about everything: the box of tapes, the VCR, the old man who I had come to think of as Videohead, the woman in the helmet. And when I was done, he just stared at me with a thoughtful expression on his face. After a beat, he finally said, "You saw Brett Marshall's car?" "No, I didn't," I replied, a bit bewildered. "Yeah, his dad brought him one of those new Mustangs for his birthday." "Brett Marshall's a fucking douche," I suddenly shouted, cutting him off. I was frustrated by Walter's complete lack of regard for my story, and I was more than a little sleep-deprived, which was enough for me to momentarily space on the fact that I was sitting in the middle of a crowded cafeteria. A cafeteria which immediately fell silent as everybody turned to stare at me. A humiliated expression appeared on Walt's face as he looked down at the table and muttered, "Well, that was unnecessary. You want to say that shit to my face, you little fucker?" This was Mr. Marshall himself speaking, a guy who was at least 6 inches taller than me, and as previously mentioned, a total douchebag. I turned to see him sitting a mere 2 tables over, and, caught off guard by the sight of him, my tired mind could think of no other way to respond. "You're a douche?" For some reason, this made everybody laugh, which was almost as shocking as the look Brett was giving me. I turned back to find Walter still staring down and half smirking as he shook his head. "Oh, you are a dead man." The day was a bit of a blur after that. Everything around me seemingly set to half volume as I did my best to go through the motions. I went to the rest of my classes and filed away my first day paperwork in their respective folders and nodded when it seemed appropriate. The bus ride home was spent listening to music on my phone and avoiding all the awkward stares. Once I was back at my house, I went straight to my room and promptly passed out. Now I'm walking down the street outside my house, but then I stop. I stop because I see someone standing in the middle of a street. I see the woman from the night before about 10 feet ahead of me standing in the middle of the street. I could see her eyes through 2 small holes drilled into the side of the cylindrical apparatus on her head, and her eyes are bright green and quite pretty, and she says something, but I can't hear what she's saying because she says it's too quiet, and I ask her what she said, and she says it again, but I still can't hear her, and then she's gone. Then she's behind me and screaming, "I said it fucking hurts!" I was pulled out of my dream to find myself in a nearly pitch black room. I hadn't bothered to flip on the light when I came in, and the blinds were only half drawn, letting in the smallest sliver of moonlight. But before I could even reach for a lamp, the motion-triggered light in my backyard came on. My heart still racing from the nightmare, I hurried out of bed and crossed to the window, just in time to see a tall figure slink into the shadows, heading towards the garage. Shit. I grabbed the baseball bat from beside my bed and cautiously descended the stairs into the garage. The door leading out to the backyard had a square window set into its top half, and as I was nearing it, a silhouette appeared at the window. I immediately ducked down beside the door, pressing myself against the wall, and praying that I hadn't been spotted. I carefully reached out a hand and turned the lock on the doorknob. A moment later, the knob began to rattle as the figure outside attempted to turn it. A light overlooking the driveway was triggered, casting the figure's shadow across the garage floor. I watched the shadow lift both hands to its face, using them like blinders to block out the light as the figure scanned the garage. And after what felt like hours, the shadow finally retracted as the tall silhouette moved away from the window. By this point, my heart was playing a speed metal drum solo against my chest. I didn't want to move, but I had to do something. What though? Call the cops, dumbass. That's what characters in badly written horror movies always seemed to forget they could do. And now here I was, doing the exact same thing. Stupid life, imitating stupid art. I patted each of my pockets, hoping to feel my cell phone in one of them, but I didn't. Why hadn't I grabbed my phone before I came down here? Well, because you're half awake and obviously an idiot. I was about to risk it and bolt back upstairs when I suddenly heard whispering from just outside the door. On me. When we're sure. I couldn't make out much of what they were saying, but the first voice sounded vaguely familiar. After a few minutes, the whispering began to fade, muffled by the sounds of footsteps heading away from the garage. They were leaving, heading towards the street. Long after I could no longer hear either of them, I carefully glanced out the window. The lawn was clear, but something was dangling from the tree in the front of my house. A lot of something. It looked like... Motherfucker. Someone had covered the tree in toilet paper. That intense dread that had filled me a moment ago was replaced with indignant frustration as I yanked open the door and stepped outside to get a better look. A sudden kick slammed square against my back and sent me tumbling into a set of plastic trash cans, which thankfully cushioned my fall as I crashed to the ground, scattering garbage everywhere. From behind me, Brett Marshall chuckled and said, "Who's the douche now, ass clown?" Before I could respond with what I'm sure would have been an extremely clever and biting insult, my parents' bedroom light came on, and Brett took off running. I climbed to my feet and brushed a used coffee filter from my shirt as a black truck pulled up to my house. Brett hopped into the flatbed of the truck and sped off just as my dad was yanking open the kitchen door. "What the hell?" he shouted, and I quickly pointed toward the tree draped in toilet paper. My dad saw this and he let out a wary sigh. "Fucking kids." The TV was on when I returned to my room, the screen displaying the same static shot of Videohead lair as the night before. I guess this should have seemed kinda strange, since the set had been off when I left the room. but considering the preceding events of that night, I barely registered the anomaly as I climbed back into bed. It didn't take long for Videohead to show up, entering frame with the new helmet-clad victim. It was a man this time, chubby and kind of short. The guy's hand had been savagely cut off, and he held the 2 bloody stumps up above his chest in a protective manner. Probably because it didn't feel so great to let them drag on the ground as Videohead pulled him across the floor. Videohead lifted the man into the chair, and then, just as before, he turned it so that the guy was now almost entirely out of frame. After a moment, the man's head rocked back, and the part of the chair that I could see began to shake slightly. He was struggling. When sleep finally returned, it was deep and mercifully dreamless. I spent every night that week watching the feed of Videohead's lair, anxiously awaiting his exit and eventual return, with a fresh victim in tow. He always arrived at a different time, though it was usually well after midnight, and each night there would be something unique about the victim. You see, one woman was covered head to toe in dark sludge that looked a lot like raw sewage, and another, a man, had a small machine attached to his mouth, with a tube leading out of it that seemed to be pumping a menagerie of vile-looking insects from his body. I eventually talked Walter into coming over that Friday to see for himself how awesome of a find this was, and when Videohead finally showed up that night, he did not disappoint. He entered, a woman's contorted body dangling from the handle in his hand. The woman's arms and legs were hog-tied behind her back by a coil of barbed wire, and a rabid possum was scampering alongside her, biting at the woman's gnarled and bloody stomach as Videohead carried her across the screen. He kicked the possum away as they reached the chair, and Videohead bent to unwind the barbed wire holding her limbs in place. Immediately, the woman began to struggle, clawing at Videohead's already severely scarred face. Unfazed by the nails digging into his empty eye sockets, Videohead casually pulled the woman's hands away and then broke one of her arms like it was just a dry branch. Snap! Just like that. The fight quickly drained from her, and Videohead gently lifted the woman into the chair before turning it to face off screen. I looked at Walter and I said, "Right? Seriously? I mean, they're not even going to show the best part?" he asked, gesturing at the turned chair, angled just out of frame. "Walter, but that's the whole point. Whatever you saw up until now is nothing compared to what you're not being shown. There's nothing scarier than the unseen. Dude, you don't get that?" Walter shrugged and said, "Man, I don't know. Plus, it was boring up until then. I guess the thing with the badger was pretty cool, though. Walter was a possum." Yeah, I like that part. Anyway." Walter yawned and slowly stood up. "I think I'm just going to take off." This left me feeling pretty bitter, and I didn't bother walking Walt out. As I listened to the door close below me, Videohead once again came into view as he started back across the screen. Whoa. Leaving twice in one night. That's new. As I said this, Videohead stopped in place, almost directly in the middle of the frame. He cocked his head slightly, as if straining to hear something. Videohead then turned to look directly at me, and his face seemed to light up. He grinned at me then, and it's worth noting that, on a scale of 1 to 10 of bone-chilling creepiness, that grin would have scored a perfect holy fuck. After another tense beat, Videohead turned and exited the frame, leaving me sitting there looking like Lenny holding a freshly crushed puppy. For about 5 minutes, that's how I stayed, mouth agape and waiting, hoping that Videohead would return. Perhaps he had simply left something in his car, and that little fourth wall break had really just been him spotting a stain on a couch cushion or something. Hell, I bet there were stains all over that place. There's no need to panic, I told myself when the Videohead didn't return. I made my way downstairs to lock the door to the garage, and then hurried back up to my room and grabbed my bat. Which is why I'm not going to panic. I pushed my dresser in front of the door, and then, just to be safe, I locked the window as well. Surveying the room, I remembered Monday night's visit from Brett, and immediately grabbed my phone. Who has two thumbs and the presence of mind to no longer make cliché mistakes? I continued, trying to distract myself from my own increasing heart rate, and then the backyard's motion-triggered light came on. This time I didn't bother checking to see what had set it off. I could hear the doorknob downstairs rattling as someone tried to turn it, followed by the sound of breaking glass. I quickly unlocked my phone and dialed 911. The line rang once, and then a familiar female voice answered with a faint, "Hello?" Hi, yes, someone's trying to break into my house." The operator let out a surprised gasp. "Really? Oh, that is awful." I suddenly realized why I recognized the voice on the phone. It was Videohead's first victim. The woman from my nightmare. "There's no one coming to save me, is there?" "I'm sorry, sweetie. I'm afraid not." I pulled the phone from my ear and tossed it onto the bed as the sound of creaking door hinges filtered in from downstairs. Someone was in the garage. The stairs began to creak as the intruder slowly climbed up to my room. After all this, I still jumped when the knob to my door began to rotate. The door was locked, but it was one of those cheap residential indoor locks, and it only took about 5 seconds of forceful turning before the bolt snapped open with a loud clunk. After a pause that felt no shorter than several eons, the door finally swung open and immediately banged against the dresser. Videohead leaned out of the darkness and into my room, looking even taller than he did on screen. Nearly 8 feet would be my guess, considering he had to duck beneath the doorway to enter. It was at this point that time slowed to a crawl. I tried to back away, and it was like moving underwater. Videohead shoved the dresser aside and started toward me. That creepy as shit grin stretched wide across his face. I held the bat up in front of me as he neared, and Videohead easily swatted it out of my hands, which caused me to stumble back onto my bed as he raised the bucket helmet over my head. And then he was gone. Huh? I lowered the arm I had held up to block my face and glanced around to find Videohead nowhere in sight. I realized I was sitting on something and pulled out a universal remote from underneath my ass. The same remote I had programmed to the VCR. I glanced at the TV and found my answer in the form of a blue input screen. A single word spelled out in blocky white lettering hovered at the top left of the frame. Eject. Without another thought, I unhooked the VCR and shoved it inside one of the trash cans besides the garage. But this didn't quite feel like far enough. So I snuck out with my dad's car. Somehow the commotion earlier hadn't woken either of my parents, and I drove around, trying to locate the empty lot where I had originally found the VCR. But I couldn't, and eventually I ended up chucking the machine into a dumpster behind the Best Buy. My logic was that their lack of reasonable prices was at least partially to blame for my present predicament, and the least they could do was assist with the disposal. When I got back home, I cracked open my laptop and searched Netflix for the most benign comedy I could find. I settled on the first season of The American Office. and eventually managed to drift off to sleep. The dream I had that night as I slept, well, I don't really want to talk about the dream I had that night, and you don't want to hear it, even if you think you do. Trust me. You just don't. I spent the most of Saturday cleaning out my room, which surprised the crap out of my mom, but my dad was still a bit pissed at me since I told him I locked myself out the night before and had to break one of the panes of glass on the door to the garage to get in. But then I asked if he would drive me to get a replacement pane and teach me how to install it, and his mood instantly brightened at the prospect of me actually volunteering for father-son handiwork. After that, I tried to call Walter. No answer. And then my brother, thinking I might ask him about the box of tapes I had found, even though by this point, I was certain the VCR had been the source of everything. And I ended up getting his voicemail anyway. I'd been feeling weird all day, almost as if I was hungover from the intensity of last night's events. And to be fair, the entire week had been pretty draining, and I ended up passing out around 9 p.m. while watching Let's Plays on YouTube. Thankfully, that night I slept like a rock and didn't have a single dream that I could recall. I woke up Sunday actually feeling pretty good. Walter finally called me back, and I apologized for being a pretentious dick. We went and we saw some awful action movie that ended up being thoroughly entertaining in a so bad it's good sort of way. It was nice to be watching a film that I knew was just a film. Sitting there in the theater and laughing my ass off at the unintentional comedy gold unfolding on screen, I finally started to feel like it was actually over. My brush with darkness had been just that and nothing more. I knew I was lucky to have skirted so close to danger and lived to tell the tale. But now it was done. It was time for me to return to my old, boring, regular life. But then came Monday. I knew it was going to be a weird day when I stepped outside and felt how unseasonably chilly it was. I tried to shrug it off, chalking the cold up to nothing more sinister than global warming. But there was a strange nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. A feeling like I was somehow responsible for the strange shift in weather. Of course, that was absolute nonsense, I told myself as I retrieved a sweater from my room and hurried back out to the bus. Who did I think I was? Halle Berry in X-Men? I was still smirking at the mental image of me dressed like Storm as I reached my locker and started to dial in the combination. And then I pulled the locker open, and my smirk instantly vanished. There, wedged inside, was the bulky top-loading VCR I left in Best Buy's dumpster Friday night. I immediately slammed the locker shut, and several senior girls turned to glare at me. There's like a big snake in my locker, I said, pointing as I quickly turned and started down the hall to class. All that morning, the only thing I could think about was what was sitting in my locker. Just sitting in there, waiting. Walter had a dentist appointment that day, and I ended up eating lunch alone. I found an empty table at the back of the cafeteria and sat facing the wall as I racked my brain for a solution. Why not just set it on fire? Let that bad boy burn until it was nothing but ash. But then I remembered that, according to a slew of real paranormal encounter shows which I frequently watched. Listen, we all have our guilty pleasures. Mine is just really silly. Anyway, you're not supposed to burn haunted Ouija boards because the element of fire actually makes malign entities stronger. So what then? Well, I googled disposing of haunted objects on my phone and read that I should tie large stones to the VCR and toss it into a running body of water, like a river or deep stream. One site suggested filling a kiddie pool with salt water and submerging it in there if I couldn't locate a suitable natural water source. but I seriously doubted I would be able to explain that one to my folks. I was searching Google Maps for the nearest river when I heard a familiar voice approaching. Brett. He was talking to one of his idiot friends as they sat down at the table directly behind me. That's when my mother effing mom decides to barge in without even knocking, and I'm just sitting there, the dick's in my hand with two lesbians going to town on a double-ended dildo on my computer screen. Brett's friend, I think his name was something stupid like Clyde, well, he started to laugh. Oh, fuck my ass, man. You don't know how to lock a door, dude? Well, I thought I had. Anyway, now my mom's so freaked out. She's pissed. She made my dad block internet access to my room. She thinks I'm going to become a sexual deviant just because I like a little girl-on-girl action. No internet? That's like, dude, what do they call that? Crueler than usual punishment? Bro, tell me about it. And so I went digging through all this stuff from my dad's bachelor years that he's got stashed in the shed out back. And guess what? Dude, I found straight up box full of porn out there. Problem solved then, Brett. Sure, they might be a bit bushier than you're used to, but still. Yeah, but the only problem is like, they're all VHS tapes. So? You don't have an old VCR laying around? No. Dude, that shit's from like the 80s. Why, do you? No. Exactly, nobody does. Brett grew quiet for a moment, and then suddenly he shouted in my direction. Hey! Something small ricocheted off the side of my head, and I looked down to see a single tater tot roll beneath my chair. Hey, fucker! When I didn't respond, Brett tossed another tater tot at my head. Hey! I let out a long sigh as a third tater tot bounced off my shoulder and landed in my jello. What? I nearly hissed as I quickly spun to face Brett, whose arm was posed and ready to throw another tot. Hey, you little shit, you got a VCR I could borrow? I tried my best not to smile. You know what, Brett? As a matter of fact, I do. To say that Brett looked surprised when I pulled the bulky machine from my locker and placed it in his outstretched arms would be an understatement. Here, you could keep it. Really? Thanks, man. I shut my locker and smiled at him. Yeah, go fuck yourself, Brett. I walked off, leaving him standing there beside my locker and looking more than a little confused. When I was halfway down the hall, Brett turned and shouted, Oh, I get it, dude, you're funny. I spent the rest of that day trying not to think too much about what I had just done. Sure, I felt a little guilty about giving the VCR to Brett, but then again, it was Brett that I gave it to. Besides, I think we can all agree that he had been asking for it. And I don't just mean literally. Still, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that even a total douche like him didn't deserve to die. But who's to say that was going to happen? For all I knew, the VCR would work just fine for Brett, and he would get to abuse himself to his heart's content. Now, as it turned out, I only had to wait until later that night to find out the answer. I was in my bedroom, actually doing homework of all things, when suddenly my TV turned on by itself. I checked to see if I had accidentally hit the remote and found it sitting on the nightstand beside my bed, well out of reach. I grabbed the remote and was about to switch the TV off when I saw what was on the screen. It was a handheld found footage style shot looking in through a window that appeared to be a teenage boy's bedroom. After a beat, Brett entered the room, holding a bottle of lotion. He locked the door and then tried to turn the knob to ensure that it was actually locked. Brett had already hooked up the VCR and had a tape ready to go as he moved to the TV and undid his pants. Now, thankfully, the partially turned blinds blocked most of Brett's lower region from view as he slid his underwear down and hit play. I couldn't see his TV screen, but the baffled look on Brett's face was enough to tell me that what he was watching was not vintage porn. Though it wouldn't matter for long. In that same moment, Videohead appeared beside Brett and slammed the metal helmet down onto his head. There was an abrupt cut as the feed suddenly switched to Brett's point of view. Looking through the helmet's narrow eye holes, I could see that Brett was being dragged down a dark stairwell and into what I immediately recognized as Videohead's lair. Brett's breathing became more louder and panicked. He glanced at the clay wall to his right and then to the left. And that's when we both spotted me. More specifically, a monitor set into the wall displaying a shot of me sitting there on my bed in what appeared to be real time. I reflexively held up a hand to check, and sure enough, my double on the screen immediately mirrored the gesture. To Brett, it must have looked like I was waving. Videohead continued to drag Brett across the room, giving me a quick glimpse of the rest of his new wall, which I could now see was covered in dozens of monitors identical to the one I was on, each monitor displaying a shot of a different person sitting in a room somewhere and intently staring at the screen. Then Videohead lifted Brett into the chair and turned him to face yet another part of his lair that had, up until now, remained unseen. The view through the eye holes was pretty limited, and it took me a second to fully understand what I was seeing. The wall the chair was now facing was covered, from floor to ceiling, in eyes. Hundreds of human eyeballs, to be specific. I assumed this was simply a macabre form of decoration, perhaps trophies from each of Videohead's victims. But then he moved to a small metal table in the corner of the room, and that's when the eyes turned to watch him. Each pair of disembodied eyes seemed to move in tandem, tracking Videohead's every gesture as he retrieved an odd-looking device from the table. It had a thin handle and two clamps jutting from it that resembled those things girls use to curl their eyelashes, and slowly approached Brett. Videohead then bent down so that he was at eye level with him, giving me a nice long close-up of his gore-stained, pock-marked face, and then Videohead jabbed the clamps into Brett's eyes and yanked. I was expecting the feed to cut as Videohead ripped out his eyes, but it didn't. If anything, Brett's point of view became even clearer once it was pulled free off the helmet. The room spun as Videohead turned and pressed the device to a bare spot on the wall behind him, mounting the eyes in place and providing me one final wide-angle shot of his lair as Videohead grinned up at me, proudly surveying his work. I hit a button on the remote and the TV switched off, which seemed to instantly depressurize the foreboding atmosphere that had enveloped the room. I sat the remote down and let out a wary sigh. Did I feel guilty? Maybe. Did I feel relieved? Absolutely. It was then, amidst the slew of thoughts and questions racing through my mind, something dawned on me. My mom was right. Maybe I needed to start reading more books.